All right. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see me? Maybe just with like a thumbs up or in the comments if we're up and running. Hey, is everyone here? Can you hear me? Can you see me? All right. Yeah, I think we're live and up and running. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate you sticking this out as we went through some technical difficulties, but really glad to be able to connect. So let me just share my screen with some slides, and we can get started. All right. So yeah, just wanted to start off again by saying thank you to Pearl and to the rest of the Yes Conference team for organizing this great event, and to all of you for attending, all of you in the lovely audience, and for bearing through some of those initial technical difficulties. Before we go any further, I did want to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Roey Norenberg. I'm the founding president and the executive director of High Schoolers for Carbon Dividends, also known as HS4CD. I graduated from high school in New York last spring, actually, and I'm now on a gap year before heading to Columbia in the fall. I started up HS4CD about a year and a half ago with the vision of it becoming a grassroots youth organization that focuses on promoting the carbon dividends framework, and I'll explain more on that in a bit. But more information to come, but I wanted to give you all that very brief preview before we got started. Some quick thoughts about today. I'm hoping that this workshop will challenge the way that we all think about climate change and climate policy a little bit, as well as inspire us all to take real and genuine action to move the needle. At the end, I'm also going to be presenting some opportunities and different avenues to get involved with HS4CD. So just keep your eyes out for more information on that front. All right. So I wanted for us to get started by talking a little bit about the problem. I want to pose two different interventions regarding the way we think about climate change and the detrimental impacts that we potentially face as a result of it. And so the first intervention, just wanted to see maybe if you could comment just with a quick yes, if you've heard the phrase, quote unquote, we need to save the planet before. Or maybe just do one of the clapping hand or other emojis. Yeah. All right. I'm seeing a bunch of reactions. I've certainly heard that phrase before. Yeah. Not surprising. And that's because obviously it is very, very common. It's a very, very common phrase in the climate movement. But here's the thing, right? It's not really true. The planet itself, the rock that we live on, that's going to be fine with or without our action. It's existed for billions of years before us and is likely going to exist far, far after us. So instead, the collective battle that we face right now with climate change isn't to ensure that the planet itself exists, but rather that it exists in a condition that is hospitable to human flourishing, right? Condition that is hospitable to human flourishing. I know that what I'm saying and the intervention I'm posing might sound very slight, very minimal, but the way that we talk about and the way that we frame the problem is going to be really crucial to our success in passing some meaningful legislation down the line. To that point, right now there's a proclivity in the climate movement to talk about climate change in nature-based terms, right? As you can see here, saving the polar bears, stopping the ice from melting. And the truth is that, yes, these things are issues and these things are very important. But if the public narrative is that we as humans need to sacrifice for the sake of nature, right, that we need to sacrifice to solve these problems, we're always going to be losing the public relations angle. It's also not especially true, right? The issue that we face with climate change and the response that we have to it isn't jobs versus polar bears, pick one. You can see in this nice little graphic, the world is surprised about, our planet is surprised about us talking about jobs versus the environment. Why does it have to be versus? It's not, right? But we often talk about it as though it is. And so from now on, when we think about the problem, I want us to think about it as though we're acting on climate because we're selfish, right? So that we can enjoy the planet, right? We can enjoy Earth. And that leads us into a conversation about what exactly it is that is at stake for us. And I don't need to explain to you all the disastrous human consequences that we could face if we choose not to act. Everything from environmental disasters, right? Tornadoes, flooding, property damage and destruction. Economic disasters. This is an article actually published under the Trump administration, a U.S. government assessment that says Americans will pay billions more for climate change, and that's the best case. Medical, right? There are many medical groups who say that climate change is one of the largest public health challenges we might have to face in the 21st century. Agricultural, dire consequences for American agriculture and global agriculture. And national security, right? So the U.S. military has called climate change potentially catastrophic to our national security interests. So in thinking about climate, I'm asking you all to be selfish, right? Think about it as us being selfish and to do whatever you can to prevent these consequences for us. Wanted to stop at this point to see if anyone had any questions. You could just text them into the comments if you would like, if you have any questions, and we'll stop again later on. But just wanted to briefly see if there are any questions. All right, doesn't seem like it. So let's move on to the second intervention that we have. And that is thinking of climate as a risk management problem. So lots of people like to talk about climate and climate change in absolutes, right? Either we are doomed or we're not doomed. Either the climate and climate change is solved or it's not solved. Either the science is settled or it's not settled. Again, this isn't really true, right? There are no black and whites when we're dealing with climate. We do know for certain that about the greenhouse gas effect, right? That pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is going to negatively affect our climate. But we don't know precisely what impact it will have. There's a very wide range of projected outcomes in terms of the consequences that we will face. And so the question is, with this uncertainty, right, without these absolutes, how do we act? How do we legislate? So Professor Martin Weitzman, who passed recently, but he was a prominent economics professor from Harvard, had a profound insight on this, which he chronicled in his book titled Climate Shock. And that's at 1.5 degrees Celsius to 4.5 degrees Celsius. That is the most likely range of global warming, according to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN IPCC. First of all, that's a huge range, right? 3 degrees Celsius is a massive range. 4 degrees colder was the Ice Age. Think about our bodies with a fever. Just a very, very slight increase or decrease in temperature can make our bodies go awry. And right now within the climate world, the hotly debated question is where within this range we're going to fall, with consequences ranging from very, very little to very, very large. And so back to Professor Martin Weitzman, he says that while this is a really interesting intellectual exercise, it doesn't matter in the end of the day. If we're in the business of making sound public policy decisions, right, in the business of making sound public policy decisions, we're going to need to make these sound decisions in the face of uncertainty. To understand this a little bit more, let's go back to this range, the 1.5 degrees Celsius to 4.5 degrees Celsius range. This is only the most likely range, right? So that means that there's a small, very small, but not zero chance that we end up either below or above that range. There's a chance we end up with global warming that's below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that, our consequences are going to be very, very little to none. That would be great. I wish that happens. There's also an 11% chance that global warming ends up taking on an effect of over 6 degrees Celsius. Over 6 degrees Celsius, just so you all can understand, is over 11 degrees Fahrenheit. This would likely lead to civilizational collapse and damages that are really beyond any qualification. So, of course, this is a less likely outcome, right? I keep saying less likely outcome because it's only 11%. But would you go on an airplane that you would know before boarding has an 11% chance of crashing? Absolutely not. Would you play Russian roulette if you had an 11% chance of dying? No, you'd be a fool too. Right? So we need to be thinking about climate change as a game of chance, and a really, really dumb game at that. In the words of Elon Musk, quote, "We are running the most dangerous experiment in human history right now, which is to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before there's an environmental catastrophe." It is a dangerous and pretty stupid game. We could be fine, but why would we roll the dice? And so when talking about the issue, you might be talking with people who may bring up that it might not be that bad. They would be right. It might not be. But ultimately, that's not important to our response in the way that we legislate on this issue. Wanted to stop again at this point to see if there are any other questions, comments, thoughts about anything. All right, so moving forward, just one second. Moving forward, the question now, of course, is how do we solve this, right? How do we minimize our risk? How do we address the climate crisis? First of all, wanted to mention that we are very, very fortunate, very lucky to be in a position where we know how to solve the problem. There are a lot of problems in the world that we don't know how to solve. So we're very fortunate to know exactly how to solve it. And that's transitioning from a very carbon-intensive economy, like the one that we have right now, to a very low-carbon economy. Put simply, we're going to need to lower the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's measurable. It's a simple matter of science. The more difficult question, of course, is how do we make this transition? How do we move from carbon-intensive to low-carbon? And that's something that doesn't have a short answer to it. It's likely going to take on many different approaches and many different responses. But with that being said, there is one tool that's quickly emerging as the most efficient and the most effective climate policy. Most efficient, most effective climate policy that's agreed upon by climate experts and economists alike. And that's putting a price on carbon. I know a price on carbon might not sound very inspiring, but it is unbelievably powerful. And it's likely going to end up being the single most important tool that we use in response to the existential challenge that we face. At its most basic, pricing carbon lets us charge for emissions, right? So economics teaches us that when something gets more expensive, you're going to get less of it. If we make carbon dioxide more expensive, we're going to get less of it. Compare that to right now when emissions are practically free, right? There are no real disincentives to use it. We're basically subsidizing carbon in our economy. Beyond that, there are various justifications for pricing carbon. So there's an economic case, which I detailed just now. Pricing carbon is going to discourage activity that causes the problem, and equally importantly, encourage people to invest and to innovate, right? Invest and innovate. Right now, we're just relying on people to do what is right for the sake of what is right. And that's not going to lead us to a solution. We're also going to need to align our economic interests, economic incentives with environmental outcomes, making them a common North Star. So think about aligning these two nice little arrows. That's the only way that we're going to get a solution to this problem. There's also a moral case for pricing carbon. So if I were to be playing kickball, right? I like playing kickball, but if I were to be playing kickball and I kick the ball through the neighbor's window, the responsible thing for me, of course, to do is to go to that neighbor and offer to pay for it. There's the same concept here in a principle that's called the make the polluter pay principle, centered around a lot of individual responsibility and accountability. So put simply, a really well-designed carbon price can do the majority of the heavy lifting on emissions reductions, and become the cornerstone of any effective response to climate change. Wanted to stop again for any questions about either the way that we think about the climate problem or carbon pricing. And just feel free to put them in the comments if you have anything, even if it's in the middle of the presentation. Yes, which groups do I think are most opposed to carbon pricing? So it's a good question. There are a lot of groups that favor regulations. I'd say they're against carbon pricing. And, there's definitely a discussion to be had, but I personally tend to think that, unleashing the power of the free market and using carbon pricing is ultimately going to lead us to a much more productive, a much more sustainable outcome in terms of both letting businesses and industries adjust and eventually, addressing climate in a more thorough and more lasting way. How much would I say that we should price carbon as? It's a good question. I don't have a specific number that I like to point to. I think there's a lot of merit to the discussions around, where exactly we price carbon. Carbon is priced per ton of carbon dioxide emissions. So I don't have an exact answer. I think there's a lot of good numbers out there, but certainly something that, gradually grows, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But yeah, both very, very good questions. All right, so moving on to carbon dividends. That is why I'm here today, to talk to you all about carbon dividends. A carbon tax, a price on carbon, as a standalone concept, is not necessarily a groundbreaking insight. It's something that's been known about and talked about for a very, very long time. What's been missing, sort of, is the political pathway to implement it. And that's largely because a carbon price is, it's a tax, and that doesn't exactly win over voters' hearts. There's, of course, a political game to be won if we want to have lasting change and lasting policy. And so luckily, there is a very simple and very innovative policy platform that has been picking up steam. It also happens to be backed by the leading climate proposal broadest climate coalition in American history, and is the leading bipartisan climate proposal currently in the political agenda. And that plan is the carbon dividends framework. The basics of the carbon dividends plan are to put a price on carbon emissions at the source, right? So oil wells, coal mines, etc., pricing carbon, and then giving the money back to the American people in the form of a quarterly dividend. A carbon dividends plan has various implications, starting off with economic. Under the carbon dividends framework, 70% of Americans, over 70% of Americans, would make a net profit from the dividend compared to the increased cost of products, while around 75% wouldn't lose any money. To contextualize a little bit more, the average American family of four would get about $2,000 in dividend payments in the first year alone. And those, 25-ish% who are going to be losing very, very marginal amounts of money, goes back to the individual responsibility principle, right? If you're going to be using the most carbon-intensive products, you might have to pay a little bit more. But again, very, very minimal and very low impact. There are also various environmental implications. So in America, with a carbon dividends framework, would exceed its commitments under the Paris Climate Accords and limit greenhouse gas emissions significantly more than any previous administration has been able to. Put simply, people under a carbon dividends plan would be getting paid to solve climate change. So I want you all to think about this as a no-regret strategy, and I'm going to show this video of Frank Luntz, who you might know. He's a climate pollster, a GOP pollster, actually, a little bit right of center, who's discussing this line of thinking to Congress.
The audio isn't coming through for the video.
Huh. Interesting. Do you have any idea of how I can turn it on?
This is Claire. Yeah, I think try at the little green button at the bottom that has a screen on it. It says share video via link, maybe? I don't know.
Let's see. Yeah, let's try that. One moment. Let's see if I can get this to work. Share video via link. It's saying that there's a network error. All right, so we might have to skip the video. Basically, I'll give the rundown of it. It's Frank Luntz, and I'll send you all this. Actually, I'll put the link in the chat for it as well, so you all can watch it later. But it is a great video. Highly recommend that you watch it. Very brief, 45 seconds long. Frank Luntz explaining to Congress why it's worth adopting a carbon dividends framework, and how even if the climate science is wrong, we'd be getting various economic benefits that we wouldn't be getting otherwise. So, and if, of course, the climate scientists are right, saving the world and avoiding potential devastation and destruction. All right, so let me share my screen again with the presentation. All righty, so that was a little bit about the wonky policy details of a carbon dividends plan. Beyond the nitty-gritty, perhaps the coolest thing about carbon dividends, like I mentioned earlier, is that they're the only major climate plan currently with bipartisan support. The only major climate plan with bipartisan support. And that's critically important for a couple of reasons. First, in order for the bill to pass, right, any bill needs to pass to be successful. And that's especially crucial in the Senate, where climate policy has historically gone to die. Especially in such a divided Congress as we have today, very, very partisan legislation is going to have a tough time seeing the finish line. Bipartisanship is also very important for our plan to last, right? Any climate policy that's built around the hope of sustained one-party rule, right? Any climate policy built around the hope of sustained one-party rule is doomed to fail. Between now and the year 2050, we're going to be governed by at least 4 different presidential administrations and 15 different Congresses. So if we want to avoid a long, long game of regulatory ping pong, which will end up being terrible for the economy, terrible for the environment, and won't solve the problem, we're going to need bipartisan support. And within that vein, the Carbon Dividends Plan is uniquely suited for the bipartisan agenda, and they come, as I mentioned earlier, with the broadest climate coalition in American history. Carbon dividends have been endorsed by everyone from top cabinet officials in every administration from the past 50 years, including George B. Shultz, Ronald Reagan Secretary of State, and Stephen Chu, Barack Obama Energy Secretary, to 27 Nobel Prize winning economists, 3,500 of the nation's top economists, and companies and organizations ranging from Microsoft and Ford on the one hand to the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy on the other. Really hard to overstate how very historic this is. It's pretty much without precedent to have this many Nobel Prize winning economists agreeing on anything. But to have them also in agreement with top Republicans and top Democrats is something that's never been done before. So there's another brief video here. I know the audio won't work, but I'll show it anyways because the audio is just background music on this one. I'll just see that's loading. Just a nice little graphic highlighting the very historic coalition of 3,500 economists who have signed on to the carbon dividends framework. Oops. Alrighty, wanted to stop at this point again for any questions about carbon dividends more specifically. And again, if you have anything, feel free to put it in the chat either now or at any point throughout the presentation. Yes, it's a good question. What's to stop businesses from passing the tax along to consumers? So first of all, for businesses, it's going to start being more expensive, right? Creating products is going to become more expensive. So they're likely to start, in a competitive marketplace, start looking at ways to reduce their costs. So looking to innovate, looking to invest in renewable energy sources. In terms of the impact of the carbon tax, that is where the dividend comes in. So a carbon tax as a standalone concept is often rightfully critiqued for having very harmful implications, especially for the lower and middle classes. A carbon dividend will solve that by putting money into Americans' pockets. So if the businesses decide to ignore the tax, first of all, the tax itself is going to increase, meaning the dividend payments are going to increase. And with the consumers having more money in their pockets, they'll be able to offset any attempts by businesses to just pass on the tax to other consumers. Has there been any legislation proposed in our Congress yet relating to carbon dividends? No, not yet. So there hasn't been a major push yet, and I'm going to get more into why in a second, and more on why and how we can get it to there. But there are definitely rumblings along the political world about it, and so definitely something to look forward to on the horizon. Yes. So the difference between taxes and dividends, very good question. So the taxes are the taxes that the companies are going to be having to pay. Industries and manufacturers are going to be having to pay if they're using carbon and emitting carbon into the atmosphere. These taxes are then going to be turned. The money that's generated from the taxes is going to be returned to the American people in the form of quarterly dividends. So instead of the money going, like our income taxes do to the government, and they decide what to do with it, the money that's generated from this tax is just going to be brought back to the American people, helping to offset the cost of, increasing cost of products, as well as anything else that they might want to, purchase or anything like that. Alrighty, so let's, all good questions. Wanted to move on to HS4CD and what High Schoolers for Carbon Dividends is. Of course, if you have any other questions, keep asking. So with all of the support, right, you might be asking and you might be wondering why exactly it is that carbon dividends don't exist yet. Would be a very, very good question to ask. And that's not because there's significant ideological opposition, right? No significant ideological opposition, but rather because right now there's a perceived lack of demand from constituents. As we all know, bills really only get passed federally if there's demand from large swaths of the population. In 2009, actually, during Obama's first term, a congresswoman who didn't vote for cap and trade, which was the carbon pricing mechanism back then, was asked why she didn't vote for it. And she mentioned that she didn't hear from enough of her constituents. As a follow-up, the reporter asked how many she would have needed to hear from. The answer was only 100, right? So 100 out of an average of 700,000 people per district. That's something we think is very, very achievable. And so that's where we as HS4CD High Schoolers for Carbon Dividends come in. We're part of a larger constellation of groups that is working to build support for carbon dividends on a grassroots level. We are the high school wing of the movement, as indicated by the High Schoolers for Carbon Dividends name. And we believe our work is particularly impactful within this broader network of groups working for this, because historically when young people unite behind something in force, others pay attention, and that's especially true in the climate movement. And so the last thing I wanted to discuss before wrapping up and taking some final questions is talking more about the specifics of our mission and how you can all get involved. So what we're doing right now, our main mission is to build a really massive national network of student leaders from all walks of life and all backgrounds in support of the Carbon Dividends Framework. We currently have a presence in 33 different states, as well as the District of Columbia. You can see from the map a pretty even split of Democrat and Republican led, with hundreds of student leaders signed on. Right now, our main focus is organizing a massive statement in support of carbon dividends, like I mentioned, from student leaders from every part of the country, with the goal of eventually packaging that into a really powerful media punch and creating a national network of grassroots student leaders. Eventually, we want to take that grassroots network of student leaders and mobilize it, right? Shift towards some political work, political advocacy on a local and a national level, and all of that. Of course, our final end goal is to pass a carbon dividends framework through Congress, which I know sounds ambitious and bold, and it is ambitious and bold, but I think that we can do it. The last thing before moving on into how you can get more involved, I wanted to mention a little bit about why you should all get more involved. The first is that there are a lot of people in the world who like to talk about problems, right? And it's important to talk about problems. But by joining HS4CD and High Schoolers for Carbon Dividends, you guys can become a part of the much smaller group of individuals that focuses on solutions and does something that's really never been done before in working to pass ambitious and lasting climate legislation. On a more personal level, plugging into HS4CD will connect you with other top student leaders across the country and present you with an opportunity to interact with members of media and members of Congress. Finally, though we're already established and we have a presence in well over half of all states, we're still very much in the growing phases of our organization. So plugging in now will allow you to take on really exciting leadership roles that might not be available at any other time. And so the last sort of tidbit is how you can all get more involved. The first step would be to sign on and support, and in doing so, become a part of our expansive national network. I'm going to put the link in the chat right now for you all to sign on and support. And this is just a very quick type form, Google form. Oh, it's not Google form. It's a type form. Shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 minutes. But this is just adding your name in support of the Carbon Dividends Framework and the work that we're doing. So once you're on that form, you're also going to have the opportunity to indicate that you would like to become a student leader who's active in your state. We would love to have as many of you active in Delaware as possible. We actually have a very active, very robust Delaware State team already, composed of over 24 student leaders from the state. So, would love for you all to join us. If you do want to be a student leader, you'll have an opportunity on the type form to register for an onboarding session. Those happen every Wednesday at 8:30 and every Saturday at 3:30. And then after that, I will connect with you and help you officially join our HS4CD Delaware team. If you have any questions about anything that I mentioned there in terms of the process for signing on and all of that, I'll also put my email in the chat so that you can reach out to me at any time. And finally, there's also our Instagram handle, which I wanted to share so that you all can follow us there and see what all the good work that we're up to. So that's pretty much all I have for us today. I wanted again to say thank you to you all for joining. Before we wrap up, I know there's a group selfie feature on here. So would love to try that out if you guys are open to it. Let's see how to navigate this. So yeah, I'm going to, I think, invite you all to take a virtual group fee. Let's see. All right, I'm not quite sure how this works, but let's try. Okay, and so wanted to stop at this point to see if there are any final questions about anything that I presented today. And feel free again to put them in the chat if you do. All right, well, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. If anything comes up and you do have some nagging thought or concern or question or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me with my email, rowie@hs4cd.org. I also put it in the chat. And, hopefully we'll see you all signing on to the forum and eventually joining our Delaware State team. So thank you all for coming. Again, really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And hopefully you got something out of this session. And we'll continue to do some great work in the climate world. All righty. Thank you, everyone.
No. Come on. Come on.
Thanks again to Mr. Nornberg. We hope to see you at our next sessions. And another thank you to our sponsors that are supporting the Youth Environmental Summit.